As already Otto showed, we have become very, very rich because we have used a lot of fossil fuels. And why should we stop that process? My background for saying something about this is that I've been teaching in Asia, Asian Institute of Technology, where I try to know about development in the world and environment. And I learned at that time that we have many first world problems which are ridiculous compared to the real problems of the world. And I've also, like Lars Tvede, been in future studies. I have been chairman of the Danish Institute for Future Studies for 8 years. Alex Epstein, I can recommend his books, they are very good. And he says some very, very interesting and very correct things to my mind. An enforced net zero would be catastrophic for the world. If we try to, by planning economy and political pick the winners like energy islands and PTX and whatever, if we try to make net zero in that way, the cost will be huge and very catastrophic for the world. The benefit of carbon, even at this time, hugely exceeds the cost. And also, when we are using fossil fuels, we get more robust towards disasters. We saw that also in an earlier presentation, that the deaths by disasters have declined tremendously. And why that? It's because we have access to cheap energy and information. And I still think that nuclear power is much more expensive than fossil fuels for a long time. Because it can only do one thing good, it can make electricity. But that's only 20% of the power need in the world. We also need to, for all other purposes, and there the raw materials for plastic and chemicals and transport fuels and so on. And in that regard, fossil fuels are still much the best. We saw the same thing as Otto showed. I'm showing you the same thing, that more fossil fuels makes us richer. There's a very, very high correlation between the use of fossil fuels and the emissions of CO2 and the GDP per capita. We see the same thing with electricity. There is no such thing as a low energy rich country, simply. It cannot be done. When I visited Thailand in this winter, I went back to my old university and gave a couple of lectures. And I showed them this table here, which I think is quite interesting. It shows the development of the temperature in the last 100 years. It's about from 13.5 to 14.5 degrees Celsius. And the water level has increased 30 centimeters in that period. But what had happened to the rest of the indicators? Population increased from 1.9 to 7.7. Infant mortality decreased from 20% to 4%. Life expectancy more than doubled, 35 to 72 years. Wealth, GDP per capita from 2,000 to 16,000 USD per capita. Education from 32% getting educated to 88%. And raw materials, using Simon's abundance index, it has increased sevenfold. And percentage without electricity from 30% in 1990 to 10%, and yield in farming from 1 ton per hectare to 3.5 tons per hectare. And malnutrition in the world from 1950 from 65% to 7%. So you could naively believe that this very, very nice development is caused by the world getting 1 degree warmer. but that would be completely rubbish. What is true is that weather and climate doesn't mean very much for human development. Actually, it means very little. And even IPCC recognizes it. If you read their summaries, they would say that all other factors are much more important for human development than the temperature. And you all know that rich people are living in cold countries and in warm countries, and the same with poor people. There's no real correlation here. You also have to acknowledge that the social benefit of carbon is huge. I asked ChatGPT to give me an estimate based on the oil price, and they came forward with $480 per ton carbon. And I think it's actually too low, because you have to use a higher carbon price. It's a theoretical discussion how high a price you should use, but eventually the price could be very high, because we simply need the carbon, we need the energy to make fertilizer and everything else, or we would die. So the price is actually even higher. But it gives us a benefit price of 1,000 USD per ton. And as we have, according to IPCC, about 2,000 gigatons stored, it will have a value of 2,000 trillion USD. That's the value of carbon in the earth. That's 20 global GDPs. Think about it a little bit. Say you have an income of 500,000 Danish kroner, most of you will be in that area here, and you just multiply by 20, and that's 10 million kroner, and you don't even want to bow down to pick it up. That makes no sense at all. So it's such a huge value which is stored in the earth. I think we should use most of it. We should invest in getting more out and not divest. The social cost of carbon is wildly exaggerated. I have seen many of these reports, and they are more or less flawed, all of them. First of all, not all of them includes adaptation. They think that the stupid farmer looks at his plant, which is getting dry and doing nothing. No, he's not doing nothing. He's either watering the plant or shifting to another plant which can tolerate dryness. And the studies also underestimate the beneficial parts of having warming. Lower heating costs. The heating costs in the world are 10 times or more bigger than the cooling costs. So we will save a lot of money on heating costs. And we will also get higher agricultural yields in general, because a wetter and warmer and more CO2-rich world will give a higher agricultural yield. There is one sure net negative consequence, and that is water level rise. But building dikes is cheap, and it will, for instance, in Denmark, if we should build all the dikes 1 meter higher in the next 100 years, it will cost about 60 billion Danish kroner, and that's over 100 years, so it's not a huge amount, it doesn't mean anything. And the carbon tax we use in Denmark for trying to get rid of our agriculturists is 400 USD per ton, which is completely over the top. Lomborg has this famous example about the adaptation, where he describes that if you don't adapt to things, then you can have hundreds of millions of fugitives. Think about a pure Vietnamese peasant standing near the sea and just letting the sea over 100 years reach to his knee. I don't think he will do that. But if you adapt, the problem is very, very small. But if we stop fossil fuels, many people say we should stop it, we should stop them now. That would be a disaster. I have asked ChatGPT to write a nice poem about that. It's in Tolkien style. In one fell swoop the fire ceased, engines stalled and famine increased. Black gold gone, mankind's bane, left us naught but endless pain. You will get the slides later so you can enjoy the whole poem. And one thing which I'm much of an expert in is food production. I have been in aquaculture, still in aquaculture for many years. And I have read the different reports about food production in the future. And I can tell you for sure that climate and weather means very little for the global food production. It's not insignificant because you can drought one place and you have too much water in another place. But on the average, it doesn't mean a lot. The only thing really matters in food production is demand. If somebody wants to get some food, it will be produced. So the real reason behind low food production and hunger is not lack of food production capacity, it's lack of ability to buy the food because the people are too poor. We can see that there is a very large spare capacity in the world. In the world, we are only producing half per hectare of what a good Danish farmer can do. So just by using ordinary, well-known, proven technology, we can double the food production of the world. And we have seen no signs at all of declining yields, even if we have this 1 degree change. And that's because the farmers, they can adapt to everything. They have a technological development trying to make their yields higher and higher. And heat and moisture and more CO2 is good for plant production. However, there is one man-made disaster which can happen to food production. And you can see that below here. That is a situation in Venezuela. When you got a socialist government, food production was cut in half within a few years. Now it's very popular to have climate models and try to see what will happen in the future. And so I have made a climate realist model. And let me explain. If we look at the recent increase in atmospheric CO2, we have taken 600 gigatons carbon from the fossil fuels and we have moved them into the biosphere, where we have observed a greening, an increase in biomass. And we have also seen about 25% go into the ocean, where we can see a slight less alkalinity. And there's no other expectations which not violates the iron law of mass conservation, which says that nothing disappears and nothing comes out of the blue air. I'm calling this model the climate realist doomslayer model because I'm very, very inspired by Julian Simon. He's a late Julian Simon. When I went to Thailand, I studied him, and he showed that on all accounts, human beings have it better and better, and this trend has continued. The actual model is inspired by Roy Spencer, and it says that the uptake of excess CO2 from the atmosphere is a function of the actual concentration and an equilibrium concentration. And I also use a climate sensitivity of 2.3, which is lower than the average IPCC numbers. Most of the IPCC models are running too hot. They simply, all their forecasts, they're using an extreme unlikely scenario and using too high climate sensitivities. That's why they can come up with 4, 5, 6 degrees. It can never happen in the real world. Of course, somebody always thinks that there's a cause and effect, but they don't realize that in nature, most processes are coupled. It means that CO2 influences temperature, and temperature influences CO2. And we can see from the Vostok ice cores that about 10 degrees Celsius gives an increase in equilibrium atmospheric content of hundreds, so that's 10 ppm per degree. Then, when will fossil fuels run out? I first have to say that it's a fool's game to predict the peak of resources, because the long-term view is that we always find more as we need it. But basically, there ought to be an end for the reservoir. We can find more. I don't know if you know that there's some methane hydrates in the sea, which the amount of material is just as high as the total amount of other fossil fuels. But anyway, I have made an equation for the peak fossil fuels with using the number from IPCC of that there's 2,000 gigatons left. But I would like that we could find more, because that would be absolutely beneficial for us all. And then I have calculated 3 scenarios. That's a peak fossil fuels where we do nothing. We don't make any actions at all politically. We just let the fossil fuels become a little bit more expensive when they get more rare, and then they are overtaken by other production methods. And then there's another way of looking at it, that is we simply stabilize the existing discharge at this level we have now, 10 gigatons per year. And then there's a net zero, where we go to zero in 2050. That is impossible for any reasons you can talk about. And it will never happen, and it would be disastrous. But still I want to calculate it. So of course I compare my model with the observations for CO2 and for temperature anomaly. It works okay, and you can see the results here. The results is I do nothing. We will increase the CO2 in the atmosphere to between 600 and 700 ppm. That's about 50% more than now. And the temperature will increase to a little bit more than 2.5 degrees over the pre-industrial period. And I use here that it is not true that IPCC is saying that CO2 stays in the atmosphere forever. No, it doesn't. It has a low retention time of only 5 years, actually. So it will immediately react if we either stabilize production or cut it down. The atmosphere and the temperature will react immediately. Now we have to look at the damage function. Otto was also discussing that. And you can see here's the damage function. It says how many % of global GDP will it cost us to have a temperature degree of a given level. And as you can see, 2.5 degrees is barely significantly less than zero. Maybe a little bit less. But it means simply that when we go 100 years in the future, then we will be 1% less rich at a point in time where we anyway will be 4.5 times richer. It's marginal, and we can never measure it because there are many other factors which are much more important, like artificial intelligence, which Lars Tvede mentioned. It's obvious, something which could change our growth much more than climate damage could decrease it. So we should use most of our available stored solar energy. It would be the benefit of doing that will several orders of magnitude exceed the costs. I can put in here that the idealistic optimal climate policy would be to have a global carbon tax, but that's not real politics. It will never happen. People cannot agree either to have it or how big should it be. So if we can't do that, the next best is absolutely do nothing, because all the things the politicians do, they make the situation worse. It costs us more money than the climate damage cost us. It's energy islands, PTX, carbon capture and sequestration, which I am not so positive as Lars is about that, because you have to use very much of the power plant's energy to do that. So the power plants get much less effective and much more expensive. So I don't think this is a good idea. So I just ask you to not be afraid of climate change and enjoy life. That's the best thing you can do also for the future of the world, because if we all enjoy life and consume nice things, the world will go forward. Thank you.